Hello everyone, this is Callie Person for Simon Says Stamp. Today's quick tip video is all about embossing powders. There are 10 embossing powders exclusively made for Simon Says Stamp. We have the standard must-have colors in white, black, clear, gold, silver, and of course there are a few that add some shine and sparkle as well. These powders are made from finely ground resin and polymer and are thermoactive, meaning they melt when they're heated and creates an embossed or raised effect with a metallic or glossy finish. This is a swatch sheet that I made using all 10 colors. The first column and the third column are those colors embossed over white cardstock, and the second and fourth columns are shown with those colors embossed over black cardstock. As you can see, there is a slight difference in how they'll appear depending on the cardstock color that you use. It's helpful to get a visual of what the embossing powders will look like on contrasting cardstock colors like this. Embossing powders work best with a pigment ink, notably a clear embossing or watermark ink. White pigment ink pads are a staple in almost every paper crafter's stash, so that's always handy for embossing as well. One of my favorite ink pads to use for embossing is the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. Before I share some techniques, let's get into the basics of how to use embossing powders. I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock now in my stamp positioner, and I'm using an anti-static powder tool. The powder being brushed on your cardstock will help eliminate any static that will cause stray embossing powders to cling to your cardstock where they're not wanted. Once your cardstock surface is prepped, the stamp of your choice can be positioned in your stamp positioner or on an acrylic block for stamping. I'm using the clear embossing and watermark ink now and inking up that stamped image so that I can apply that ink to the cardstock using the stamp positioner. To ensure proper ink coverage on your paper, it's always a good idea to stamp twice, especially if you have a stamp positioner that will allow you to stamp in the exact same place. Before applying the embossing powder, you'll want something to catch the loose powder underneath your cardstock. I'm using a folded up sheet of printer paper. Others are known to use some traditional coffee filters, and there are also catch trays with a funnel system. While that ink is still wet, you'll want to sprinkle on that embossing powder so that it'll catch the stamped area and then tap away the excess. To return the excess unused powder back to your jar, simply funnel it back in and securely close the lid for proper storage. To heat set the powder without any issues, be sure to warm up your heat tool and make sure it's nice and hot before applying that heat to the embossed area. You'll know the embossing powder has been activated as it melts into the cardstock and produces a solid shine, replacing the embossing granules that were there before. This example was done with ultrafine gold embossing powder and embossed over white cardstock. Here's a look at two more greetings that were stamped with clear embossing ink on black cardstock and then embossed with white embossing powder. The embossed effect is a fun way to add texture and shine to your projects. Now that we've gone over the basics, let's get into some techniques that we can use with embossed panels. The first technique I'm going to share is embossed resist. This technique can be done with any embossing powder color. For this example, I've used clear embossing powder over white hammer mill cardstock, and I'm ink blending a gradient using Surf Positively Saturated ink. The embossed area is raised and shiny, so it's resisting the ink, and so I'll buff away any excess ink that's sitting on top of that resin, restoring its shine and making the lines more crisp. My next embossed resist example is using watercolor. I've embossed the same background using clear embossing powder over a piece of watercolor paper. After wetting the surface and applying my pigment, you can see that the embossed areas also repel the color that's being applied over the embossed areas. This allows you to apply a color to the background while maintaining the look of the stamped embossed area. Images for coloring can also be embossed. This floral image is from the Beautiful Friend stamp set, and I've stamped it with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink and embossed with clear embossing powder over hammer mill cardstock so that I can use alcohol markers. The raised areas act as a well for each area that you're coloring and helps you stay inside the lines. This is especially helpful when you're using this technique for watercoloring. Embossing stamped images before coloring will also help keep your stamped image crisp. That's because the ink underneath is being trapped by a resin or polymer from the embossing powder. Which leads me to the next fun example. Have you ever wanted to stamp a colorful stamped image but also want a contrasting background, like colorful fireworks against a dark night sky? You absolutely can with clear embossing powder. So here I've already stamped my fireworks image with some pinks and yellows and created a nice gradient. Then without moving that stamp in the stamp positioner, I'm going to stamp that exact image over the previous one using clear embossing ink and then sprinkling clear embossing powder over it. You'll want to make sure that that ink is fully covered by the embossing powder so that it gets trapped underneath once it's heated up to protect that color that's underneath. Now that those colors are trapped underneath the embossing, you can add a contrasting color over the top of the embossed image. I'm using a dark blue in Galaxy Positively Saturated ink, and I'll ink blend around this to show you that you can ink blend a really dark contrasting color over lighter colors like yellow and pink in this example, while preserving those lighter colors underneath. Some ink will sit on top of the embossed areas, but it's being repelled, so all you have to do is remove the excess ink using a cloth or paper towel. And that is how you use the ink trapping technique with embossing powders. Next, I want to show you some fun techniques using embossing powders with adhesives. My first example is going to be using Terrific tape, which is a double-sided adhesive. I've made two simple lines using two sizes of the Terrific tape. I'll cut off the excess and then remove the backing using my adhesive lifter tool. Once the backing is removed and the adhesive is exposed, I can sprinkle some embossing powder over that adhesive and it will automatically cling to the adhesive. This example uses the MERMAID embossing powder and creates a fun and sparkly design to the background when heat set. This would be great if you wanted to make your own plaid background. My next embossing powder technique using adhesives involves liquid adhesives, particularly clear lacquer adhesives like Glossy Accents from Ranger. This technique is also known as the snow or frothing technique because it creates a lot of texture. In this example, I'm using little pine needle clusters here and applying the adhesive to the pine needles where I want it to look like it's been snowed upon. Then I'll sprinkle white embossing powder over the adhesive. I'll repeat that step with the other two pines, adding that clear adhesive where I want the snow to be, and then sprinkling the white embossing powder over those areas. That adhesive takes a bit to dry, so you have some time to mass produce a few branches for this technique before you have to heat set them all. Not only will the embossing powder melt, but that adhesive will also puff up and create lots of dimension and the look of snow on these pine needles. You can also use white liquid adhesive. I just find that the clear lacquer adhesives puff up a little bit more when heat set and create a bit more dimension. I mentioned that this was called the snow or frothing technique, and by frothing I mean you can add dimension to images of whipped cream or even frosting on a cupcake. This is such a fun technique for adding texture and dimension, and I find myself using it every winter. The last technique I'm sharing uses stencils. You can use your clear embossing ink to dab over the stencil design, apply your embossing powder of choice, and then heat set it for your design. That result will look a lot like a stamped embossed image. So in this example, I used white texture paste because I want you to see once heat set what that result looks like, and it's completely different than if you were to use clear embossing ink. So here I'm heat setting it with my heat tool, and you can see how that puffs up and creates so much texture and interest to the panel. The texture paste causes the embossing powder to puff up a lot like the clear adhesive that we used for the frothing and snow technique. Embossing powders not only give your card more interest, but they can also add lots of dimension, and cool techniques can be done with them as well. If any of these techniques are new to you, I hope you'll give them a try soon. Thank you so much for watching today's Simon Says Stamp Quick Tip video. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.
Hi there, I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at simonsaysstamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.